What is up, grinders? Welcome to another episode of MMA Ground. Well, it's not the ground and pound. It is the crunch time before lock here for UFC Mexico. Moreno, Royval 2. Actually a fun card, Squirrel here. 13 fights to work with. Somehow there's 2 5-round fights. I think that's going to go under the radar. We'll hit on that, but you've got big favorites. You've got closely lined middle range fights, action fights in the middle range. You've got bounce back spots for fighters. This thing has a little bit of everything. The only thing it doesn't have, high weight classes at altitude. I really like the UFC not putting big guys at altitude to gas out.
Yeah, it's I didn't even realize, like, I knew it was at elevation, but I didn't even realize until I looked it up this morning that it's like 2,000 feet above Denver. So yeah, it's a very, very high elevation. I guess we get this in baseball sometimes. We get to Mexico City. Yeah. I think they get on there like once a season or so, or at least they have in the past. Home runs start flying out of the ballpark.
I was going to say, it was like, remember there was like a total for like 15 and it eclipsed it by 1 million, and everyone's like, wow, that was a once in a lifetime spot.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, so very high elevation. I think it has an impact. I think, obviously the home cooking or the, home octagon advantage for the some of the Mexican fighters, I think, is in play. But it is like definitely like distinctly higher quality than a lot of the fight nights.
Yep.
Maybe not as much as a pay-per-view, but we don't have to to view it. So I think it's a good all-around card. I think it's going to be a fun Saturday night.
I think telling me I can watch my fights tonight.
Yeah.
No. Don't change what's working, TJ.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Two, like the last 2 times, like the one I actually like chopped like first place and everything, it was optimal. And this past time, I took a really big nap in the middle of the card and I slept through like the good first half of it. And so that might be necessarily have to be what I do again tonight. As soon as I'm done my NBA show, I'm on NBA Crunch Time with Tim and Taylor later. Just go to sleep right after.
Yeah.
No pressure, Squirrel. No pressure at all to try to nail this card for TJ. Listen, he's the best advertising piece we've ever had, I think, because he doesn't know the scoring. He knows nothing. Let's break down this card as much as we can. And what is your thought process on lineup builds? Because there's a lot of ways you can go. Personally, this is a tricky one for me because I could see a lot of these mid-range fights dictating the whole construct of your lineups. Like there's a lot of fights that can hit 100+ points. Then you've got a lot of the range up top, Squirrel, that I think there's a world where some of these 9K fighters don't break 100 points. And then you have the next range, which I'm going to say, the grappling, right? There's a ton of grappling. How are you going to construct your lineups and where's the starting point?
It's a tough card to break down in terms of DFS because it's pretty, I guess at least the ownership, I think, is going to go in the right direction. I think the higher priced fighters like Yasmin, in particular, like the top, like Blender and I were speculating over like what her optimal percentage would show to be. And he's saying, he loves playing the lower owned female fighters, but he just couldn't do it with Yasmin. And I kind of agree. And the optimal percentage, I think, is sub 15%. I think I said it was probably going to be 15-20%.
It's terrifying.
It's just so hard to see, other than this, somebody slipping on a banana peel and dislocating her elbow. It is hard to see, which is just as likely to happen to Yasmin as it is to Sam Hughes. It's difficult to see just because, Yasmin doesn't fight at that pace that is going to get you that super high score. She doesn't mix in, the grappling points. I think she's probably going to win the fight, but she really might not put up enough points to land on the winning lineup at that price, unless you see a bunch of underdogs win.
Don't we wish that she was higher owned? Isn't that the problem here?
Yeah, and like normally, I think we're showing her at about 16% ownership, and normally I would say, you got to go over that. But you don't. It's actually not that likely, that she lands on the winning lineup again. Whether she lands on the winning lineup is probably going to be more a product of how many underdogs win in other fights rather than what she does. Just because it's difficult to see her, getting that first round finish, and she probably needs that and a high scoring first round finish to land on the winning lineup.
Exactly, and that's what I was talking about when it comes back to bounce back spots. I mean, there's spots on these this particular slate where it's like, here's your Mexican A side, right? But the commodity that you're investing in is, for instance, let's just take Uruguay as a 6-1 favorite, and she just came off a knockout loss. Like, it's not like you're betting into her losing by decision or being durable. There's a lot of question marks on those types of fights. Then you get to the Raul Rosas Jr., who faced a very low tier last time, but of course got exploited one time as a young prospect. So let's not get off track, because I think that's a great starting point, was the Yasmin potential fade there, because that makes sense. If she wins a decision, I just don't want a piece of that fight, period. Let's just go right to the 2 5-round fights. We were talking off air very quickly before we started here. People aren't going to know that there's 2 5-round fights. We have to inform the people that there are, because they're 2 high-quality fights. My problem is one of them is the obvious play to jam into lineups. The other one, I think, has the ability that the realm of possibilities is much wider, which makes me a little concerned about what that is going to score like over 5 rounds.
Yeah, and I might approach the 5-round fights a little bit differently in like smaller field compared to the super large field contest. Particularly, I'm thinking about going under the field on Brandon Moreno, which is really scary. Yeah. Just that I think, especially with the narrative, right? He's going to be so highly owned. I think we've got him around 50%, 59%.
Let me jump in.
Was it?
I have to jump in. If I told you in his career, he's had a ton of fights, that he's only scored over 100 points twice. That's shocking. He's a fantastic floor play with an endless ceiling, but he never hits the ceiling.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of paths where he's not super cheap, right? Even for a favored fighter, he's not in like the lower 8,000 range like we've seen before. I think just last week with like Volkanovski and Topuria were in the mid range. Like Moreno's 8,800. Like, what if he gets a early second round win? Yeah, right. That's like 80 something points. And so many people are just going to start their lineup with Brandon Moreno. I don't necessarily want to go crazy, playing Brandon Royval. I don't know, because I think Moreno's going to win this fight. I think the odds have been moving in his direction, and some of it's just the narrative like lines up kind of so well. So I don't know, and I do like the idea of going like slightly over the field on Royval, just because I think there's even some chance he gets there in a loss. I think that was my expert survey hot take. Yeah. So I'm gonna, I feel very confident in Brandon Moreno winning the fight, and I'm still gonna go into the field on Moreno and over the field on Royval.
Second 5-round fight, which we think is going to go a little bit under-owned. The big thing here, I think, is looking at it from that macro standpoint of the whole fight going under, where it should be higher owned because it's a 5-round fight. We have right now, Aguirre is a 45% ownership, Ortega 30%. We are betting into one of the more unknowns than we ever have before with Brian Ortega. I mean, this guy came into the UFC hot. I mean, this guy was ripping off limbs and knocking people out. What's he do? He kind of steps up in that competition. He falters a little bit. Obviously, anybody would against Holloway, etc. And he holds his own in those fights. He doesn't have the most amount of significant strikes, but point per dollar, he's not the worst guy in the world. Now, you look at a guy like Yair Rodriguez, there's 2 conditions for him. It's going to be volume based, and it's going to be finish equity for him. That's it. I feel like on this slate at 8,500, people will take both favorites in the 5-round fights. That's a typical thing people do in their lineup, Squirrel. And I think that might be a problem on this slate, because salary is something you're going to be a little bit weary of in how you're going to open up that salary.
Yeah, actually, I think Liam broke this fight down really well. Is that, Brian Ortega's last fight was against Yair Rodriguez. Ortega was favored. He suffered a dislocated shoulder. It wasn't like he was getting smashed, right? Like he's, dislocated his shoulder. We don't necessarily, like Yair Rodriguez since then hasn't done anything that makes us think like he's like, the much better fighter. Why is Ortega now the underdog? It doesn't necessarily make sense. I guess there would be some concern that maybe he dislocates his shoulder again. And that's an actual possibility. Like that's a repeating injury that can happen multiple times. But hopefully that doesn't happen. I really like going with Ortega here at 7,700, like being over the field, because I think this is going to be a close fight. If it goes 5 rounds, like Ortega has pretty heavy volume, I think he can get there. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to like fully fade Yair Rodriguez. I think obviously, the fight's maybe a little bit more of a coin flip than the odds indicate. And with 5 rounds, Yair Rodriguez can get there at 8,500 as well. But I'll probably end up under the field on Yair Rodriguez just because I plan to be over the field on Ortega.
If the ownership was going to be realizing that it is a 5-round fight, this is probably the one I'm not going to play. It sounds crazy, but it would be like on a normal slate that everybody knows it's a 5-round fight. There's just more opportunity for this particular fight to stall out, whether it be through grappling, whether it be through distance striking. That's the problem. But the pace, I mean, Yair's at home. We know he's going to be trying to come for a limb. He actually called out pretty much to Poirier and was like, I don't like the guy. Like, you know what the UFC is doing, Swirl. They're trying to put him in a spot where, hey, you beat him before. The thing is cage rust. It's like, Ortega, what are you going to look like? So I think the next spot for me, and we kind of nailed how to handle those 2 5-rounders, is the value. Okay, these spots kill me. I hate these spots so much, right? There's a value play on this slate, finally. Rodriguez, the other guy, right? And we have him against Bondar. Bondar looked terrible on the scales. I got to be honest. He looked very, very bad. I don't look into that too much, but this is a guy who I was weary of coming into the UFC as it was. And now you have him against a Mexican prospect that's been submitting people, knocking people out. He's an action fighter. So Bondar has wilted down the stretch. I feel like Rodriguez is going to be quote unquote good chalk. And I say that because he has the ability to score over the 3 rounds, right? Like we saw Bondar slow down. We've seen him taken out deep in fights. I mean, it was a headbutt, right? But we all know he kind of got knocked out last time. I feel like the ownership isn't on this fight either. That makes it even more interesting. And again, I like taking the value long-term on these spots, unless I have a strong take that like Bondar is going to take him out, right? There's the leverage on the slate. If Bondar at 8,200 is going to take him out, that wouldn't be the worst case. I just don't see how he does it.
Yeah, I have a funny thing with Blender. I was doing the show with Blender, and I was just saying I don't see a lot of Mexican fighters losing decisions here. And we saw this we've seen this in Canada, we've seen this in France, we've seen this, in the Middle Eastern fights. It's rare that if the fight goes the distance, that just because you think about how the crowd can impact a judge's thought process. I mean, a judge is sitting there really trying to parse out, like, well, how significant was that? How impactful was that strike? And when the crowd is going crazy, when one fighter punches the other, but not vice versa, I mean, it has to make an impact, potentially even makes an impact on the ref's decision in terms of, stopping a fight. I think you've got to go with Rodriguez here, especially at the elevation. Like if Bondar is slowing down later in his fights, that's probably not going to do super well at the higher elevation of Mexico City. So I do like Rodriguez here. I do kind of know what you're saying is that people go crazy for the line equity here. You're getting a little bit of, because they're about, I think Rodriguez is $200 cheaper than Bondar, and he's going to be like, because of that, he's going to probably be like twice his own, which doesn't make sense. It's still about a 50-50 fight. I do see Rodriguez winning the fight.
That's the frustrating thing, because from a GPP standpoint, you want a guy like Rodriguez's style coming from Bondar. You know what I mean? Like a guy that's going to go out there and potentially look for a finish type of deal.
Yeah, I'm probably going to own this fight at about the ownership that we're projecting. But yeah, it's kind of a fight. The smaller field, the ownership's going to go through the roof on a guy like that. Just people click that first. And then the higher dollar, right? Higher dollar and then smaller field, because there's a value play there. And I almost feel like the range of outcomes makes it possible to fade that fight and be okay too. Yeah, I think so. I don't know if it's going to be that highly owned in small field, because I think people are going to gravitate to Torres, who's got even more win equity for the dollar. And he's just at 8,300 rather than like Rodriguez at 8,000. Because Rodriguez got about a 52% chance of winning that fight compared to Bondar about 48. But like Manuel Torres at 8,300 has like a 60% plus chance of winning the fight And so I think people are going to go there. I mean, that's a place I'm going to go right with him because he's got good first round finish odds. He's got good volume. So yeah, I think people are going to gravitate to Torres, but I'm not going to get away from that either.
Yeah, I think that Torres fight is actually an interesting one because there's these group of fights, right, that kind of have a inside the distance ceiling type mold in this middle range, right? Like you look, that's going to absorb the ownership. I personally don't know how that fight busts. Like Torres and Duncan fight at a high pace. Duncan's now starting to grapple in some of his fights. The problem for me is like Torres could shoot his load early. Like he could just go out balls to the wall. And what happens when Duncan scores a third round finish? It's like dominant ground and pound. Like there's a way that there's immense amount of leverage on this slate. Do you expect it to be the 12% ownership that we have for Duncan? Because that's pretty low, like 3x the leverage on it.
Yeah, and I think like in our simulation tool, I think Duncan is showing up as one of the best leverage spots on the slate, which makes sense because so many people are going to be going with Torres. But there's a reason so many people go with Torres. I don't know. I just have a hard time seeing Duncan winning this fight. I'm really reluctant to go with the fighters facing the Mexican fighters that are potentially going to win a decision. Because I don't know.
But a lot of these guys are expected to win in the first round. That's the crazy part, right? Like a lot of these Mexican fighters are expected to win first round. And I think their equity starts falling off once that first round, even a like second round, if they hurt them in the first round, right? Like their equity starts falling off a cliff when that happens. Yeah, I mean, is Torres the highest owned guy on the slate?
I think
no.
Moreno.
Yeah, of course, Moreno is. That does make sense, but there's a fight that's been booked 7 million times on this slate. And of course, Squirrel, why do they have to put this fight on this slate? Because that makes it even more crazy because there's a fighter that has never won a UFC fight, right? That I think everybody and their mother would have to consider in DFS every time this fighter fights. It's Daniel da Silva, the John, the Mike. He's changed his name 700 times to stay in the UFC is the joke you and I have made. Yep. This guy is a potent scorer for fantasy, but doesn't win fights. Now he's got Charas, the Mexican, at home, quote unquote, and they both miss weight. What the hell is happening with this fight, John?
Yeah, I remember 5 months ago we were joking around that it's obviously going to be Daniel Silva's last fight in the UFC, and that he was going to change his name, and we were going to be breaking down another one of his fights, in 5 months because he was going to sneak back into the UFC. The joke's on us because 5 months later we are breaking down the same fight. You said there were some bounce back spots. This is a bounce again spot. I don't know. I'm probably gonna have Charas as one of my highest owned fighters. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence that the referee stopped the last fight because he thought that Lacerda might literally be dying, in the fight. So because he went limp, right? He was like in a choke. From what I gather, right? Obviously, I'm not a fighter, but from what I gather, that is the technique you're supposed to do, or strategy you're supposed to have. If someone's got a choke on you, but it's not effective, you go limp, conserve your energy, let the other fighter, burn out his arms, burn out his energy. Attempting that choke is, to squeeze it as tight as he can. But the fight got stopped because Lacerda went limp, but he was obviously not winning the fight. I think Charas is going to win this fight again. They both missed weight. From what I understand, the Silva missed weight first. Literally missed weight first, but they'd spoken in the morning and they agreed that they were going to, take the fight anyway. So that then Charas started rehydrating, and so that he missed weight by like 5 pounds. But it was really just he knew the fight was going to happen no matter what.
That's actually a smart play, John.
Yeah,
that's a smart fighter.
I do, and I've noticed that Charas' first round finish odds have gone up since the weigh-ins a little bit. Not dramatically, but I think he's got the highest first round finish odds on the slate. Let me double check that, make sure that's correct. Charas is about 41%. So I like Charas here. I like going over the field. I know he's 9,300. But I think that's going to keep ownership down a little bit. Doesn't show up in the simulations as a great play. I just think he's going to be tired of this fight and want to finish the Silva.
Why this fight on this slate? That's the thing for me. I shake my head because I'm like, this slate's already a little, pretty crazy, and they have to have this one. It's because they have Chairez, right, the Mexican. Yeah. That's why he's on there. But they keep booking De Silva. It's like, dude, he could come out and kill Chairez in the first round. Could, right? That literally is in the realm of possibility. And I don't think I've ever seen a guy's win equity, like his inside the distance is the same exact thing as his money line. Like they know that, like, that is his exact path to win the fight. But this broadcast is brought to you by FanDuel. We have crunch time. FanDuel. Bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. For new users in Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Terms and conditions apply. Must be 21 plus. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. And our sponsor, FanDuel, has some contests up still. And they have that different type of building of lineups. You have an ability to put an MVP in. And we do have in chat somebody looking for their MVP type plays. And I'm going to look towards lower owned guys that would have that same upside, right? Because you know what people are going to do. They're going to put in those 5-round fights in their MVP slot. Any sneaky plays that you like, maybe we haven't even talked about yet, right? Like that we could go. And the scoring is slightly different for FanDuel. So I think it is important to take that in consideration.
Yeah, actually, do kind of like the idea of going Chairez as an MVP. He's got that 41% first round finish odds, like highest on the slate. He's like pricey, so it's difficult to get to him, but he's not so pricey. Like Yasmin's like $23, Diamond's $22. Same price as Moreno. So I think people are gonna maybe click on Moreno first, not go with Chairez at all. I would look for a way to maybe get both of them into my lineup. One thing about FanDuel that's really significant is, and you actually see this flipped on NBA, but for FanDuel, the prices go way lower. So you can get like an $8 Sam Hughes, who's, again, in a fight that is not expected to end, inside the distance. I forget what is that? So that's 8% of the salary cap. What would 8% of the salary cap be? That's like a $4,000 fight on DraftKings.
There's value.
I don't mind the idea of going with like Sam Hughes, and then you can get, or if you want to maybe go up a couple dollars more, Victor Altamirano, is a fight I like actually on both sites. That's $10.
That's a good segue.
Yeah. So it's still much cheaper than you would get any fighter on DraftKings.
Yeah, we move over to the Altamirano fight. Fantastic, because we have another prospect here where a guy comes into the UFC, looks like $1 million in a loss. And this happens time and time again. And he put up 40 points against Manel Cop Santos is who we're talking about here, against Altamirano. And Altamirano is the Mexican fighter at home, quote unquote. But $7K, I think there's a good money line type play there, but I really truly worry about the ceiling. And at the same time, I'm trying to factor in my brain here that the pace is going to be here in the fight, right, John? So that means that there's more scoring built into it, because if we have that Dos Santos, come forward, that means more points for Altamirano, and people sometimes don't factor that in.
Yeah, actually, I really like Altamirano here, just because this is a fight that's favored to go to the judges' scorecards. Like Altamirano's from Mexico City. This is probably the biggest test of my home cooking theory they were going to see, pretty early in the card. But Altamirano isn't necessarily like that low volume. I mean, he'll go for takedowns. He's not a super low paced fighter. So I actually kind of agree. I think he's a really sneaky play here, and he really doesn't have to do that much. Again, at like $10 on FanDuel. At 7,000 on DraftKings, like that is the fighter that I would go to really try to get some load up on some of the higher priced fighters. I think Altamirano's going to be a guy that I'm over the field on. He's not seeing like minuscule ownership, because I think people don't necessarily want to go down to Hughes or De Silva, But yeah, I mean, I think even at 18% is I think what we've got him at. I think I'm probably going to be over the field. Like, I think he should be owned closer to his like implied win odds, which are about 28%.
Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting context because that's a 7K guy that opens up a lot for your lineups. It's like the salary relief there. He wins, he's going to very highly be right in one of the winning lineups, I'd imagine. Almost any win, because we have seen him kind of lay an egg. But again, I think the pace of the fight dictates that the playability of him.
Yeah. I mean, 28% chance to win, and I don't think it would necessarily be like some kind of super low scoring win. Yeah, I agree. I think he's one of the best spots on the card.
Sneaky play there, and then we get towards this range where you've got the Quinones, you've got the Puales. This is a tricky one here because I can see multiple for these two fights here being all over the place. Because let's just start with the leg lock specialist. Let's just go with the guy that's going to go in and try to rip your knee off, rip your leg off. Claudio Puelles is a GPP play anytime he's on. He kind of falls into the Hane Yaya. I don't know if you remember that guy. That guy could rip your limb off, but he doesn't do anything until he takes that limb home with him. And he's going to have good inside the distance line, 7,500. And you look at Ziam. Ziam doesn't score a lot of points, but he's got an opponent that he could just sit and pick apart from distance. And I really worry about that outcome being a realistic outcome in the fight. And then at the same time, if Puelles tries to roll for these stupid takedowns, these stupid leg locks, Ziam could just stand over him and finish him at any time. So like I could see Ziam being an interesting GPP play solely based on ownership. And I absolutely think Puelles is in play at any time. And the other spot there, I'm talking about Quinones and Barcelos. Barcelos is a takedown, should be a takedown machine, but falls in love with his hands. He should go in there and try to take Quinones down and control him and be a decent GPP play. But then you've got Quinones who likes to bang, man. It's a perfect recipe for these two fights to fall into an optimal lineup and potentially dictate the whole slate. Like if one of the underdogs wins here, it really opens up off of, off of the main event underdogs, right? Like these are the pivots, I think.
Yeah, I like Quinones a lot more than Puelles. I was in Madison Square Garden watching Claudio Puelles' last fight. And I still hear the boos in my ears, right? As people are just screaming at him to get up, right? Because he's just laying on his back the entire time. Dan Hooker, would occasionally run in, give him a kick, and the ref had to keep getting like Puelles to stand up. And
is that control time? Does that mean control time for Hooker?
No, yeah, it's like, what I'm concerned about is that Hooker is just standing on the other side of the cage. I'm not doing anything. And the Ziam could do the same thing. And so I think this could be a low scoring fight. Now Puelles could get there if he does get the first round finish, probably by a leg lock. He's not super high priced. So at 7,500, that's probably a first round finish is probably enough to get him on the winning lineup. I will probably own him at about his first round finish odds, which aren't that high. I think it's sub 20%. So, about 13%. That seems about right to me. I'd much rather go with Quinones, who actually I think could score well. At any point if the fight ends at any point, right? Even in a decision, I think he could do enough at 7,600, just $100 more to land on the winning lineup if he can win the fight.
Yeah, it's just such a great slate from GPP standpoint because these are the types of plays where people will probably just rather go towards Royval or Ortega, right? But at the same time, the ownership is kind of showing that these two, they're in play. Like they're 20%, they're accurate. It's just frustrating, man. And then there's like two fights that we still haven't talked about with the Aguar. The range of outcomes on this slate, this is the fight that I look at and I think to myself, wide range of outcomes. There's first round equity. There's dominance equity. There's the world that they both get around and there's nothing to be had from fantasy standpoint. And potentially this one might be the odd fight out as the Mendonca versus Aguar, right? Like Aguar is a tiny guy. If there was an atom weight men's division, we talk about the atom weight potential for women's, which doesn't exist. This guy could fight in the atom weight. He's a tiny guy. And you have Mendonca who's come down in weight. And what does he do? He gets knocked out. So it's like, where's the durability? Now he's at the weight class he should be, but he got knocked out last time. He's skill for skill probably going to be a little bit better than Aguar. Aguar is at home. The Shannon Ross fight we don't even look at, right? That gets X'd out, whatever. But I mean, there's a lot of range of outcomes in this Aguar and Mandona fight. So how are you going to handle that? Or do you agree with me that the range of outcomes is pretty wide?
I think it's a wide range of outcomes, but I'm just leaning towards Mexican fighters. And they have about the same inside the distance line, so that's something I always look for. And I know you do as well. Like, you have a cheaper fighter that's got the same inside the distance line. I'm probably going to go overweight the cheaper fighter and underweight the more expensive fighter. I do kind of like Aguilar in this spot. The home cooking, I'll take the savings and use it to go get a higher price fighter.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at this fight it is what it is, right? Like, I want to be at the field, but I also think there's an ability where this one kind of not necessarily quote unquote stalls out, but even a decision somehow for Mr. Aguar. I mean, it may not be optimal. It's pricing, right? 7,800. Like, if he gets 80 something points, I don't know if that's necessarily optimal. Are you looking at this card though for upside and money line? Because we have 13 fights. That's the number where I start thinking you need upside.
I do. I think you need some upside, but I also think there could be some sneaky upside here. I was talking about Blender with this on Friday. That with the elevation, what if some fighters gas out, and you could have some fights where in the third round suddenly the winning fighter is getting up just piles of points, right? Like piles of significant strikes, maybe control time, ground and pound, whatever the case may be. So I do think you're going to need some upside, but I don't think, as opposed to a lot of cards, I don't think you necessarily need that upside from early finishes. You could have some suddenly sneaky volume in the second and third rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're going to go to the last fight that we have not broken down yet, which is the Zellhuber and the Prado. Man, Zellhuber getting some shine here on card placement. It's hard to argue that they're trying to, not build this guy up because he's, right before the 2-5 round fights, he's 8,900, a decent prospect, but he doesn't have a friendly style to fantasy. And then you look at a guy like Prado. This guy looks like he's somewhat of a first round bully. He wants to go in there, lay a pace on you. And is it the type of fight where the ownership is kind of accurate? Because if it busts, which I somewhat lean to that it might be one of those situations where it's a decision and it just doesn't score well for Zellhuber. But at the same time, Zellhuber's long, man. He could get a weird choke or a flash type of knockout. Prado's just going overlooked here. I don't want to go crazy and fade this because we've seen Mr. Zellhuber set back already, and Prado going to be pretty damn low owned for somewhat his upside, I'd say.
I agree. Actually, I think Prado is going to be a little bit overlooked. Like, he was a guy I was thinking about for my underdogs article. He's got really low ownership for a guy that's got a first round finish as a even odds fight last July. He's got about a 10% chance of the first round finish. Like, at his price, that's probably going to put him on the winning lineup. I think we've got him at about 12% owned. I like the idea that I can own him at like 15-20% of my lineups, and I'm like at a multiple of the field on a guy that could get an early finish. Zellhuber, I think Zellhuber's got some upside as well. I mean, he's got 20-something% chances of first round finish. And he's not in that like 9,000 range. I mean, he's 8,900. So in this range, I like Rosas a little bit more, but I will have some Zellhuber as well.
Yeah, it's a fight, unfortunately. We covered it last because it's kind of organic. It's the odd fight out, right? And we could definitely see it hitting an optimal. It's like a decision is probably likely, and it's frustrating. Like, I think it's more on Prado's style of fight, right? That dictates how the scoring is.
Yeah, and I think Prado's more likely to go out there and really try to get an early win, which is actually a good strategy, right? Being the non-Mexican fighter in Mexico, like, try to get the finish. But he might get that finish. So I think you have to own him at least at his first round if you're doing multiple lineups, or even if you're doing 20 lineups, like you got to have 2 or 3 Prado in there, and it's easy. I mean, he's low priced, so it's easy to put in there. But yeah, he's a fighter that could also not score very well, right? Like he could gas out and be one of those guys, but then like maybe Zellweger is putting up a little bit more points than we would expect.
Yeah, which is pretty much the perfect way this whole card could go, is there's so much volatility. And then you look at like last week's slate, right, John, where you have 12 fights, 11 of the 12 favorites win, and now you have a card that, I mean, I don't want to say every underdog's in play, but literally you could make a point for almost every single underdog. It's really wild how crazy the slates can be different.
Yeah, I agree. But we do have some big win odds here, right? Like with especially at the higher end of the card, with Naimov, Yasmin. But like I don't think you necessarily need to go with those fighters, particularly Yasmin. So it makes it, of the fighters I think are going to be highly owned, and I think of the fights that have upside, a lot of them are pretty close. So it should be really, it should be a fun fight card to watch. The crowd's probably going to be going crazy. It starts a little bit later than some of the other cards we've seen, so it should be a good night for the fights. Yeah,
it's really frustrating just to go full circle on this one. Yasmin would be a lady I would love to invest in on any other card, right? Like if we weren't looking at so many better plays below her, that's a spot where she could potentially come out here and come out like, a bat out of hell. Like I've got to make a statement and go. She might even go for takedowns, but that's a talk for another day. Next week, I don't know, dude. What are we dealing with? 10 fights. Sloppy heavyweights. It's one of the ugliest cards I think we've ever seen. I mean, it's not pretty.
Yeah, I don't know what happens if we lose a fight. Hopefully, I think one of them was maybe canceled due to visa issues, so maybe they can find a replacement fight. Still a possibility the card expands, I hope. Otherwise, we will be at 10 fights, which is about as small as I can see. And if we lose a fight on the scales, I don't know where we go.
Exactly. I mean, then we're going to be talking about what, 3,000 left on the table for fights like a fight card like that. But here's the growth. The big GPP has filled for 100,000 to first place, the $15. So it's like the growth is here. We need to continue it. GJ, keep winning all the money so you can pile it back in. The ecosystem needs you, buddy.
I don't know. I'm not planning on piling it back in anytime soon. I did make 2 more lineups, but I'm just gonna win again.
I know. Why do we even do the show, John?
Yeah, so TJ can win money.
Guys, thank you for tuning in. And ladies, we appreciate it. We will see you guys next week for the world's worst card in the world.